1 week season.
Hello, friends and Inner Circle fam. We are back for another First League video diving into the Week 15 main slate. I'm your host, StatATL. So every week I open up the DK app. I go game by game, position by position, noting my initial thoughts. They are posted on the OWS Discord as well as on Twitter or X in the order that they appear on DraftKings. So we've got 12 games this week, starting with the Cowboys at the Panthers. So we've been attacking the Carolina Panthers with opposing running backs all season. And Rico Dowdle's coming off back-to-back games of over 120 total yards and 3 straight games with 20 or more opportunities. So the Panthers have allowed an opposing running back to rush for over 100 yards in 3 out of the past 4 games. So at 6,100, I think Rico Dowdle is a really strong play this week. The matchup's also pretty good on the other side of the ball for Chuba Hubbard. But Joe Mixon, 109 yards on 20 carries, is the only running back to exceed 100 yards rushing against Dallas since week 4. So as of late, they've been much better against the run. Chuba's involvement in the pass game, though, kind of keeps him in consideration. Certainly with rookie running back Brooks going down, he should have the backfield to himself again this week. Through the air, Adam Thielen's really appealing here in the mid-range at 5,400 on DraftKings. He's coming off back-to-back double-digit target performances with 199-yard outings in those 2 games. And then on the other side of the ball, Jake Ferguson returned last week. He was heavily involved in the offense. He finished second in receptions and targets and yardage, just behind CeeDee Lamb. So CeeDee Lamb in play almost every week, but at 3,800, I think Jake Ferguson is an intriguing option here as a paydown option at tight end. And Carolina's allowed 8 touchdowns to tight ends the past 7 weeks. So a good spot here for Ferguson. Next game on the slate is the Chiefs at the Browns. So despite facing the likes of Bijan Robinson and Derrick Henry, J.K. Dobbins, Alvin Kamara, and Chuba Hubbard, no running back has rushed for more than 62 yards against the Chiefs this season. And Jordan Mason's 69 total yards is the best to date for a running back. So definitely a spot I'll probably be avoiding the Browns backfield. Through the air, Jameis Winston's averaging 43 pass attempts per game in his 6 starts. And I think the Browns are unlikely to find success on the ground. So we'll likely see an increased pass rate here once again for Winston. It looks like we're going to get Cedric Tillman back. So between Cedric Tillman at 4,900, Jerry Jeudy at 6,200, and David Njoku at 5,200, we've got some good stacking partners for Winston if we're interested in going that route. Njoku is coming off games of 13 and 17 targets the past 2 weeks. Kind of stands out upon first pass here. I know there was some news here later today here on the 10th that Njoku may have his status in question for this weekend, so it's kind of a situation to monitor. But initially, I do kind of like this spot for Jameis and his pass catchers. So the other side of the ball, ground matchup doesn't really stand out here for the Kansas City backfield. However, the Browns have been pretty susceptible to the pass this season. I think they've allowed 600-yard receiving games in their past 8 games. So, Travis Kelce, DeAndre Hopkins, they stand out here as they're both in the 5K range. They're both averaging 9 targets the past few weeks. And, while those pass catchers I think are intriguing to me on first pass, the Browns haven't allowed a quarterback to throw for 300 yards or 3 touchdowns yet this season. And Mahomes only has 2 games over 20 DK points. So probably tempers any interest I may have in him. So if I do get to Kelce or Hopkins, they'd probably be just as a one-off here on my first pass. Next game here, we've got the Dolphins at the Texans. It looks like a 46-point team total or game total here. So Nico Collins, probably the best wide receiver in the league. He's got 20 or more DK points in over 70% of his healthy games this season. His elevated price, though, at 8,100 really does reflect that. However, like every wide receiver that's seen double-digit targets against Miami has done well, with Puka Nakua's 9 catches for 98 yards, the worst game of that group. So I think Collins is averaging around 10 targets a game. I think this is an interesting spot for him here. I'm going to expect some low ownership, but I'd certainly feel like he definitely has 30-point ceiling in him. On the other side of the ball, matchup sets up well for the Dolphins pass catchers. Both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle saw their highest target counts of the season last week, and they get Houston's secondary that's like really struggled on the outside with wideouts. Not a strong matchup for Jonnu Smith, but I do like both Hill and Waddle. And I do think that Tua Tagovailoa is also intriguing here. He's had 40-plus passing attempts in 3 straight games, and that's led to 300-plus yard passing outings and multiple touchdowns in each of those games. So I think initially this kind of stands out as a game that I would potentially be interested in stacking. Let's move on to the next game. It's the Jets at the Jaguars, a little lower of a total, right around 40. But, after last week's flop by Will Levis at kind of high ownership, I think I'm still willing to consider Aaron Rodgers against this weak Jaguars secondary again. So almost half the quarterbacks that have faced the Jags have either thrown for 330 or more yards or thrown for 4 or more touchdowns. And that's a list that includes Tua and CJ Stroud, Joe Flacco, Jared Goff, Josh Allen, and Caleb Williams. So Aaron Rodgers coming off his best game of the year. I think this is a spot that we could consider Aaron Rodgers. Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams really dominate the targets from Rodgers. They're both interesting to me this week. Pretty obvious stacking partners if you wanted to roster Rodgers this week. On the other side of the ball, I think it's really just Brian Thomas that stands out to me. He's once again kind of coming off back-to-back double-digit target weeks, and he's affordable in the mid-5Ks again. So I think that's my interest probably in the Jets and Jaguars. Next game here is the Commanders at the Saints. 43 or so point total here. Strong spot for Jaden Daniels, coming off the 2 best games of his career. Then Washington just had their bye in week 14. So I do like this spot for Daniels. Saints have allowed 5 300-yard passing games this season, which isn't really Daniels' forte, but it's good to see that that upside through the air exists. And every mobile quarterback that's faced the Saints, so Jalen Hurts and Baker and Bo Nix, Herbert and Drew Lock, they all had at least 25 yards rushing. I think Bo Nix went for 75 yards. So, on paper, this is a strong spot for Jaden Daniels. Best pairing option probably on paper is Terry McLaurin, but McLaurin only has 1 game all season of more than 8 targets and has seen his price skyrocket to 7,500. So with Noah Brown likely to miss this game, I think Zach Ertz is pretty intriguing at 4K. He's seen 30 targets the past 4 weeks. And Saints have allowed 4 tight ends to put up at least 70 yards against them. So I think that's an interesting way to go if you want to go Jaden Daniels to pair him with Zach Ertz and kind of bank on Jaden's rushing upside. And then hopefully you get a touchdown from Ertz to go along with that. First pass here, none of the Saints really stand out to me. Kamara's too expensive for his likeliest outcome, and the Commanders are above average against the run. Next game, we've got the Ravens at the Giants. The Giants have been a really friendly matchup to opposing backfields this year. I think they've allowed 7 different running backs to go for 20 or more DK points this season. So a really strong spot for Derrick Henry. He's got 5 games of 28 or more fantasy points. And that includes every game that the Ravens have won by 10 or more points. The Ravens are favored by 16 points in this one. So a spot where I expect Baltimore to control the game throughout. I think this is a really strong spot for Henry to once again give you a 28 or more fantasy output. Even at 8,300, I think he's very appealing. On the other side of the ball, the Ravens have given up many monster games to opposing wide receiver ones, as we've talked about almost every week on this video and in the Discord. And Malik Neighbors absolutely getting peppered with targets every week. I think he's averaging 11.5 a game this season. His price has dropped down to 6,400, which is the cheapest it's been since week 2. And this is borderline like a nut matchup. I guess kind of through these first 6 games, some of my favorite pieces between Derrick Henry and Malik Neighbors, are kind of in this game. Probably temper expectations a little bit with the news that Tommy DeVito is going to be starting for the Giants, but still in the week 9 game where DeVito started, I still think that Neighbors saw 10 targets. So while I would downgrade it a little bit, he's still going to be the focal point of the New York offense in a game I expect the Giants to be trailing heavily. So it's probably my interest there. Next game, we've got the Bengals at the Titans, a 47-point total here. And, the Titans D present a pretty tough matchup here. But Joe Burrow does have 5 straight games of 25 or more fantasy points, 4 games in a row of 300-plus yards passing. And that includes games against the Steelers and the Chargers, who are some pretty strong defenses as well. Josh Allen did throw for over 300 yards against Tennessee, so there is ceiling. However, I think Nico Collins is the only wide receiver to eclipse 20 DK points against Tennessee all season. So while Jamar Chase can hit ceiling against anyone, this isn't a spot that's like most likely for Burrow or Chase or even T. Higgins. And they're more expensive. And just on a 12-game slate, I just think there's going to be better places to go. I think in this game, the best matchup, though, probably appears to be for Calvin Ridley, who's averaging 9 targets a game since the Titans' Week 5 bye. And the Bengals have allowed an opposing pass catcher to top 18 DK points in every game this season except 2. And that was Week 1 against the Patriots and then Week 6 against the Giants, who were without Malik Neighbors. So I think at 5,900, I've got some definite interest here in Calvin Ridley. Next game on the slate is the Patriots at the Cardinals. This is the first afternoon game. I think it's a total of around 46. Drake May, I think to me here is interesting. He's put up 20 or more DraftKings points in half his starts this season. And the 2 mobile quarterbacks that have faced the Cardinals, which were Jaden Daniels and Josh Allen, both had double-digit fantasy points from rushing alone. So at 5,600, I think he's an interesting option this week. All of his wide receivers are cheap. Hunter Henry is actively involved. He, I think, is 3,900 or so. And if the Patriots are keeping the game competitive, I think Ramondre Stevenson is also interesting. If you go and look at the games that the Patriots keep competitive, Ramondre Stevenson has had some of his best games of the season. So that's an interesting pairing as well, May and Stevenson. And then on the other side of the ball, I think it's hard to ignore the volume from Trey McBride. He's got 41 targets the past 3 weeks. And throughout the season, he's averaging over 15 pre-touchdown fantasy points. And the Patriots have given up touchdowns to tight ends in 4 of the last 6 weeks. So maybe this is a spot for Trey McBride to kind of break that, get off the snide with that one. And during that same 6-game span, the Cardinals have also allowed 4 wide receivers to post 100-yard receiving games. So I think at 5,500, Marvin Harrison Jr., he's the cheapest he's been all season. I think he's interesting along with Trey McBride. I think I prefer McBride, but I think both are interesting here. Certainly if you want to run back a Drake May stack. So the next game here in the afternoon is the Colts at the Broncos, a 44-point total. Matchup here is pretty strong for the Denver backfield, but kind of been a carousel of who's leading their running backs in carries the past several weeks. Through the air, Cortland Sutton has been good, but he's seen his price rise to 6,600 and only has 1 game all season where he went for 4x his current price. So not really a spot I'm super intrigued there. For the Colts, the Broncos present a pretty difficult matchup across the board and not a spot that jumps off the page from my initial look. So I'll potentially have some interest in Josh Downs if he returns at just 5,100, but this is most likely a game I'll probably just avoid on a 12-game slate. So the next game on the slate here is the Bills at the Lions, probably the highest total of the week at 54.5 points. And along with the highest total, it's probably the best real-life game of the weekend. Buffalo traveling to Detroit to take on the 12-1 Lions. Bills defense has struggled a bit this season, and the Lions' preferred method of attack is the ground game, which is where the Bills have struggled the most. However, at their elevated prices, both in the 7Ks, it kind of feels unlikely that one of Gibbs or Montgomery is going to post a had-to-have-it type score with Detroit's split backfield. So to me, kind of first pass, I'm not being drawn to either of the Lions running backs. I do think at his price, Jameson Williams is probably my favorite piece here after what we just saw Puka Nacua do to Buffalo last week. On the other side of the ball, no interest here in James Cook, as Detroit is really tough against the run, haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher this season. To me, probably the matchup is the most interesting for Buffalo's passing attack. Coming off a 14-target game last week, Amari Cooper is catching my eye here. And then as like a really pay down option who has been, we'll say marginally involved most weeks, Mac Hollins at 3,800, I think is intriguing as well as an inexpensive way to get exposure to this game. Next game on the slate is the Bucs at the Chargers, 45-point total in that one. Could be an interesting spot here for Justin Herbert, as Kirk Cousins, Brock Purdy, and Bryce Young all posted their best games of the season against Tampa Bay, while Lamar Jackson, who went for 35, Jaden Daniels, who went for 28, and Patrick Mahomes, who went for 24.5, had their second best performances of the year. So I think this is an interesting spot here. Certainly if Ladd McConkey is back, I think he's my favorite Charger to pair with Herbert. And I think you could even consider a double stack with $2,600 Stone Smart at tight end. Kind of intriguing as kind of a pure punt option at tight end with Will Dissly and Hayden Hurst both injured. On the other side of the ball, maybe Rachaad White would be appealing if Bucky Irving is to miss again, but Chargers are pretty good against the run. White does have a reasonable price tag. I think he's $5,800. So a play that could be considered. I think there are stronger running back options, off the top of my head here from first look. Rico Dowdle appears to be in a much stronger spot. Same with Derrick Henry. But I think Rachaad White is potentially appealing. And then through the air, Mike Evans always has ceiling. He isn't really seeing the targets, though, to justify his 6,100 price tag. So not a spot that really stands out for me there. Next game here, we've got the Steelers at the Eagles. Battle of Pennsylvania here. Final game of the slate here. Final game of the slate. Battle of Pennsylvania. Matchup of two teams, both with double-digit wins. Eagles have been really strong against the run this season. They haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher all year, despite facing Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs and Bijan Robinson, Kyren Williams, and Alvin Kamara. So not really a spot where I'm drawn to the Steelers' backfield. And it's early in the week, but George Pickens, who missed last week's game, is looking doubtful here, which would be a really big blow to the Steelers. So I'm not really seeing a lot to like on the Steelers side of the ball. Steelers defense, though, one of the best in the league. But this is a game where they're probably going to struggle to sustain offense. And I think that's going to lead to additional opportunities for Saquon Barkley, who's got 100, plus rushing yards in his last 4 games and 7 out of his last 8. So he's expensive. Obviously, the Steelers are a strong run defense. Doesn't mean that Barkley can't go for a ceiling game here. Through the air, A.J. Brown, again, similar situation to Mike Evans. He can hit in any matchup, but the Steelers have been really tough against opposing wide receivers. And the Eagles just haven't really looked that sharp on offense the past few weeks. So at their prices, probably a spot I'm going to avoid Hurts and A.J. Brown on a 12-game slate. I guess moving to defense here, kind of the ones that catch my eye, kind of moving from most expensive to cheapest. The Commanders, the Broncos, the Eagles against this potentially depleted Steelers offense. I do like the Jets here. And then I think the only two defenses for me that are in play below 3,000 are the Chargers and maybe the Cowboys. But I would say that probably does it for me this week. I do hope to see you and your OWS avatar at the top of a leaderboard again here in week 15. And thanks for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you around the site and in Discord this week. Thanks.